Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. The town of Black Hollow was a quiet, forgotten place, nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by an oppressive forest of blackened oaks. Its past was a scarred one, marked by a devastating fire 50 years ago that consumed the old Ashwick Manor, a sprawling estate once home to the Ashwick family. The fire left nothing behind but a skeletal frame of stone walls and a strange silence that seemed to hang over the town ever since. For decades, the ruins of Ashwick Manor stood untouched, avoided by locals, who whispered tales of unnatural voices carried on the wind. Children dared each other to approach the crumbling remains, but no one ever ventured too close. Everyone knew the stories of the Ashwick family perished in the fire, and how the charred ruins seemed alive. The story begins with Evelyn Carter, a journalist from the city, who arrived in Black Hollow on assignment for Echoes Weekly, a magazine that specialized in unsolved mysteries. Evelyn was skeptical of the town's legends, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the eerie power of abandoned places. But when she began her research, the unease in the townspeople's eyes made her reconsider. Evelyn's first stop was the local library, a modest building with creaky wooden floors and the faint smell of mildew. The librarian, Mrs. Constance Bailey, was an elderly woman with a nervous air. "You're here about the manor, aren't you?" Mrs. Bailey asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded. "I've heard the stories. I'm hoping to separate fact from fiction." The librarian's eyes darted to the windows as if expecting something or someone to be watching. She leaned in closer. "Some truths are better left buried, Miss Carter. The manor is cursed. People hear things there. Voices." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Voices? Of whom? Of the Ashwicks, or something pretending to be them?" Intrigued, Evelyn pressed for details, but Mrs. Bailey refused to say more. Instead, she handed Evelyn a dusty ledger, the only surviving record of the Ashwick family's history. "Take this," the librarian said, her hands trembling. "But I'm warning you, don't go to the ruins. It's not safe." Ignoring the librarian's warning, Evelyn set out for Ashwick Manor the next morning. She followed a winding path through the forest, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As she approached the ruins, a sense of unease settled over her. The remains of the manor were even more haunting than she had imagined. Blackened stone walls jutted up like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. Vines crawled over the ruins, their tendrils gripping the crumbling structure as if trying to pull it back into the earth. Evelyn stepped through what was once the grand entrance, her boots crunching on charred debris. She pulled out her camera and began snapping photos, documenting the eerie beauty of the place. Voices from the ashes, a horror story that unfolds in chilling layers. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze. She frowned, her breath catching in her throat. It was probably the wind, she told herself, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. "Help us." Evelyn spun around, but there was no one there. The ruins were empty. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread and continued her exploration, but the whispers grew more frequent, more insistent. "Please, don't leave us." Her rational mind insisted it was her imagination, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were layered, overlapping, as if multiple people were speaking at the same time. Evelyn decided she had enough material for the day and hurried back to the inn where she was staying. That night, Evelyn pored over the ledger from the library. The Ashwick family had been wealthy and influential, but their story was marred by tragedy. According to the records, the fire started in the middle of the night, spreading so quickly that no one inside the manor could escape. But there was something odd about the official report. Witnesses claimed to have heard screams long after the fire should have silenced everyone inside. Some even said the screams didn't sound human. Evelyn's curiosity deepened when she found a journal entry from Margaret Ashwick, the family matriarch. "The voices have returned. They whisper to me in the dead of night, promising things I dare not repeat. Henry says I'm imagining it, but I know what I hear. They want something from us, and they will not be denied." Evelyn's hands trembled as she read the entry. What did Margaret mean by the voices? Were they connected to what she had heard at the ruins? Determined to find answers, Evelyn decided to return to the manor the next day, this time at night. As the clock struck midnight, Evelyn found herself standing once again at the edge of Ashwick Manor. The ruins seemed even more menacing under the pale light of the moon. She gripped her flashlight tightly, her breath visible in the cold night air. She stepped into the ruins. the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder and more distinct than before. Why did you leave us? Stay with us. Help us find peace. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She tried to speak, her voice shaky. Who's there? What do you want? The whisper stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a new voice emerged, deeper, more guttural, and filled with malice. You shouldn't have come back. The temperature plummeted, and Evelyn felt an icy grip on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around. But there was no one there. The flashlight flickered, and the ruins seemed to shift, the shadows growing longer and darker. Panicked, Evelyn fled the ruins, the sound of her own footsteps drowned out by a cacophony of voices rising behind her. As she reached the safety of the forest, she glanced back at the manor. For a fleeting moment, she saw thin figures standing among the ruins, their faces obscured by shadow. And then they were gone. Evelyn's first move was to find someone in Black Hollow who could provide more context about the Ashwick family. After asking around town, she was directed to Tobias Grayson, the last surviving worker from the Ashwick estate. Now in his late 80s, Tobias lived alone in a decrepit house on the outskirts of town. When Evelyn knocked on his door, Tobias greeted her with suspicious, watery eyes. You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong, Miss Carter, he said after she explained her purpose. Please, Mr. Grayson, Evelyn implored. I just want to understand what happened. The voices, the fire. Why does everyone avoid the manor? At the mention of the voices, Tobias flinched. He hesitated before opening the door wider. Come in, but you regret this. Inside, Tobias revealed more than Evelyn could have hoped for. He described the Ashwicks as a strange, reclusive family who rarely ventured into town. Margaret Ashwick, in particular, was known for her eccentric behavior. She was obsessed with the old ways, Tobias said, his voice low. Books about summoning spirits, rituals, and curses. She claimed to hear voices from somewhere else, said they promised her knowledge and power in exchange for something. What kind of rituals? Evelyn asked, leaning forward. Tobias shook his head. I don't know, but I remember the night of the fire. I wasn't there, it was my night off, but I swear to you, the screams we heard, they weren't human. And afterward, people started hearing the voices in the ruins. They say the Ashwicks made a deal with something they couldn't control. And when the fire came, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a punishment. Before she left, Tobias gave her a warning. You've heard the voices, haven't you? Once they call to you, they don't stop. They'll pull you back to the manor, one way or another. That evening, Evelyn returned to the ledger she had borrowed from the library. As she flipped through the brittle pages, she noticed something she had missed before. A loose she tucked between two entries. It was a map of the Ashwick estate, and one room in the cellar was circled in red ink. The word sanctum was scrawled next to the circle. Her heart raced. If Margaret Ashwick had conducted rituals, perhaps the answers were hidden in the sanctum. Evelyn decided she would return to the manor, despite the terror that gripped her at the thought. The next night, Evelyn arrived at the ruins armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and her determination. She followed the map to the remnants of the cellar, which were partially hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown vines and debris. After clearing the entrance, she descended into the dark, musty space. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something, metallic blood. Perhaps the sanctum was exactly where the map indicated. It was a small, circular room, its stone walls covered in strange symbols and carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. In the center of the room was a charred altar, surrounded by melted candles and broken artifacts. As Evelyn examined the symbols, she felt the temperature drop sharply. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than before. Free us! Don't leave! Stay! Then she saw a shadow that moved independently of her flashlight's beam. It coalesced into a vaguely human shape, its edges flickering like smoke. Who are you? Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the altar. Evelyn hesitated but approached cautiously. On the altar was a book, its cover blackened and worn. She opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes in Margaret Ashwick's scrawled handwriting. One entry stood out. The voices demand more. They grow louder each day, promising to bring back what was lost. But the price is too great. I fear I've doomed us all. As Evelyn read, the whispers intensified, drowning out her thoughts. She tried to close the book, but her hands wouldn't move. It was as if some unseen force was holding her in place. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. Evelyn looked up and saw the shadow figure had multiplied. There were now several of them, their forms circling her like predators. One of them stepped closer, its face emerging from the darkness. It was grotesque, its features twisted and burned beyond recognition. "Help us!" it rasped, its voice filled with desperation. Evelyn tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against her skin. "Free us, or join us." The shadows closed in, and Evelyn screamed. Evelyn woke hours later, sprawled outside the ruins. She had no memory of how she got there, but the book from the sanctum was clutched tightly in her hands. Back at the inn, she examined the book more carefully. The final pages were filled with frantic, disjointed entries that painted a grim picture. Margaret Ashwick had been deceived by the voices, who promised to resurrect her deceased son. In her desperation, she performed a ritual that opened a gateway to something else. But instead of her son, the ritual summoned entities that couldn't be controlled. They consumed the Ashwick family and trapped their souls within the ruins, using their voices to lure others into the same trap. As Evelyn read the last entry, her blood ran cold. The voices demand release. They say the price is one soul for many. I cannot pay it, but if someone else, perhaps they can be satisfied. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, no one was there, but faintly, carried on the night air, she heard the whispers again. "Evelyn, come back." The whispers haunted Evelyn long after she left the ruins. No matter where she went, they followed a constant, sinister murmur just on the edge of hearing. They filled the silence of the night and seeped into her dreams, leaving her restless and on edge. She could no longer deny it. Ashwick Manor had marked her, and the entities within wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Evelyn returned to Tobias Grayson, desperate for guidance. She explained what she had found in the sanctum and showed him the blackened book. Tobias paled at the sight of it, his hands trembling as he pushed it away. "You shouldn't have taken this," he hissed. "This book is a tether to them. It's how they'll keep pulling you back. They keep saying they want to be freed." Evelyn said, "What does that mean? How can I stop this?" Tobias shook his head. "Freeing them isn't what you think. They don't want peace. They want release. Whatever Margaret Ashwick summoned, it corrupted their souls. They've become something else. If you give them what they want, you'll unleash whatever's left of them into our world." Evelyn frowned. So what's the alternative? Let them stay trapped forever? Tobias' gaze hardened. Better they stay in that hell than unleash it on the rest of us. But Evelyn wasn't satisfied with that answer. As she left Tobias' house, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't listen to him. He doesn't understand. We only want to be free." Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn studied Margaret Ashwick's book in secret. The entries detailed the original ritual, the summoning, and the devastating consequences. But buried within the pages, Evelyn found another ritual alone that claimed to sever the tether between the souls and the entity binding them. The ritual required specific components: an item belonging to the Ashwick family, an offering of blood, and the reading of an incantation at the hour of midnight. Evelyn didn't know if it would work, but it was the only lead she had. The first step was finding an Ashwick family heirloom. Evelyn returned to the ruins during daylight and scoured the remains for anything that might have survived the fire. After hours of searching, she found a small, scorched locket buried beneath a pile of debris. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy Margaret Ashwick's son, James. The second step required her own blood, a sacrifice she was hesitant to make but knew was unavoidable. She prepared herself, determined to see it through. As the sun set, Evelyn prepared for the final step, returning to the sanctum at midnight to perform the ritual. Evelyn arrived at the ruins just before midnight. The place was unnervingly quiet, the usual whispers replaced by an oppressive stillness. She descended into the sanctum, her flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. She placed the locket on the altar and used a small knife to make a shallow cut on her palm. Her blood dripped onto the blackened stone, the droplets glowing faintly as they were absorbed. The air grew colder, and the shadows around her seemed to come alive. She began reciting the incantation from the book, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsating with an eerie light. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. "Stop! Don't do this! Please!" Evelyn faltered. The voices were no longer pleading, they were angry, distorted, filled with rage. Before she could finish the incantation, the shadows surged toward her, forming a massive, writhing figure. "You think you can bind us?" The entity growled, its voice a guttural roar that shook the room. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Evelyn backed away, clutching the book. I just want to free the souls trapped here. Let them move on. The entity laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. They belong to me now. And soon, so will you. The shadow entity lunged at Evelyn, its form shifting and writhing like a living nightmare. She screamed and instinctively held up the book, which began to glow with an intense, golden light. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. Realizing the book might be her only weapon, Evelyn clutched it tightly and resumed the incantation. The entity howled in fury, the voices of the Ashwick souls rising in a cacophony of pain and despair. As she neared the final words of the ritual, the rune shook violently. The walls of the sanctum began to crack, and the shadows writhed in agony. Evelyn could feel the book burning in her hands, the heat searing her palms. Evelyn, one of the voices called, softer and more human than the others. It was Margaret Ashwick. You can end this, but you must give it something in return. It won't let us go unless it takes another soul. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Another soul? What are you saying? You must choose, Margaret said. Free us or save yourself. The weight of the decision crushed Evelyn. If she sacrificed herself, the Ashwick souls might finally find peace, but was their freedom worth her life? The shadow entity loomed over her, its form trembling as the ritual weakened it. Evelyn had mere moments to decide. Evelyn's hands shook as she held the book. Her mind raced, torn between self-preservation and doing what she believed was right. The whispers grew louder, urging her to choose. Finally, she made her decision. With tears streaming down her face, she screamed the final words of the incantation. The golden light from the book exploded outward, consuming the sanctum and everything within it. The shadow entity let out a deafening roar as it disintegrated, the voices of the Ashwick souls rising in a mournful chorus before fading into silence. Evelyn collapsed, her vision fading as the light enveloped her. When Evelyn woke, she was lying outside the ruins. The air was still, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the manor was gone. She glanced at her hands. The book was gone, and her palms bore faint, silvery scars where the heat had burned her. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, there was no whispering, no voices calling to her. The ruins were silent. Evelyn stumbled back to the inn, unsure if she had truly freed the Ashwick souls or if she had unleashed something far worse. The town of Black Hollow seemed lighter in the days following Evelyn's harrowing encounter at Ashwick Manor. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered over the ruins for decades was gone, and the whispers that had haunted Evelyn were now silent. But deep down, she knew her story wasn't over. The scars on her palms and the lingering unease in her heart were proof that the shadows she had confronted had left without leaving their mark. Evelyn spent the next few days trying to recover, but her dreams were anything but restful. Each night, she found herself back in the sanctum, standing before the altar, the shadows circling her like predators. The voices no longer begged or wretchedly waited, watching in silence. On the fourth night, she woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. Her scarred palms burned as if the heat from the ritual hadn't faded. She looked around her dimly lit room, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move across the corner of the room. Then she heard a single whisper, faint but unmistakable. Evelyn, it's not over. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, Evelyn returned to Tobias Grayson. He greeted her with a knowing look, as if he had been expecting her. You freed them, didn't you? He asked, his voice heavy with both awe and resignation. I think so, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. The voices stopped. The shadows are gone, but something feels wrong. Tobias sighed and gestured for her to sit. You need to understand something, Miss Carter. The kind of power Margaret Ashwick meddled with, it doesn't let go that easily. If you free those souls, there's always a price. Evelyn frowned. What kind of price? The entity Margaret summoned was never just after the Ashwicks. It's ancient, hungry, and patient. It thrives on pain and chaos. By performing the ritual, you might have broken its hold on the Ashwicks, but you've also caught its attention. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Are you saying it's coming after me now? Tobias nodded grimly. It marked you the moment you stepped into the ruins. You're the tether now, Evelyn. The only question is how long it will wait before it comes for you. Desperate for answers, Evelyn revisited Margaret Ashwick's book. Although the original ritual and its countermeasure were no longer viable, Evelyn noticed something she hadn't before, in obscure reference to a protective rite. The book called it the Binding of Ashes, a ritual that could sever her connection to the entity once and for all. The instructions were cryptic and incomplete, but the essence of the ritual was clear. she needed to perform it at the source of the original summoning heart of the Ashwick estate. But there was a catch. The binding required a conduit to trap the entire willing soul, who would act as a vessel to contain its essence. Without such a sacrifice, the ritual couldn't be completed, and Evelyn would remain bound to the entity forever. As night fell, Evelyn returned to Ashwick Manor one final time. The ruins were eerily silent, the oppressive energy that had once pervaded the place replaced by a hollow emptiness. Armed with the remnants of Margaret's book, a set of hastily gathered supplies, and a deep sense of dread, Evelyn descended into the sanctum once more. The symbols on the walls were faint now, their glow reduced to a flicker. The altar was cold and cracked, but as Evelyn approached, she felt the familiar chill of the entity's presence. She began the binding ritual, her voice steady as she chanted the incantation. The air grew heavy, and the shadows began to stir, coalescing into the now familiar writhing form of the entity. "You cannot bind me. It is," its voice a mix of rage and amusement. "You don't have what it takes." Evelyn ignored it, continuing the incantation. As the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, the entity lunged at her, but an invisible barrier stopped it, forcing it back with a howl of fury. As Evelyn neared the end of the ritual, the room trembled, and cracks spread across the walls. The entity's form grew larger, more defined, its features shifting between grotesque facets and human, others monstrous. "You think you can cage me?" it snarled. "You will fail, just as she did." Evelyn faltered. She knew what it was referring to. Margaret Ashwick had attempted a similar ritual but had stopped short, unable to make the ultimate sacrifice. Evelyn's hands trembled as the realization set in. Without a vessel, the entity couldn't be contained. "Choose," the entity growled, its voice dripping with malice. "Offer a soul or be mine forever." Evelyn's mind raced. She had no one to sacrifice, no one she could live with condemning to this fate. And yet, she couldn't let the entity remain free, not after everything it had done. Finally, she made her choice. Evelyn stepped onto the altar, clutching the locket she had taken from the ruins. She whispered a silent apology to herself and to the Ashwicks. With a trembling voice, she recited the final words of the ritual. The room erupted in blinding light, and the entity let out a deafening roar as it was pulled toward the altar. Evelyn felt an unbearable heat coursing through her body as the entity's essence merged with her own. When Evelyn awoke, she was lying in the forest outside the ruins. The air was still, the oppressive energy of the manor gone, but something had changed. She could feel it inside her, a cold, seething presence lurking at the edges of her mind. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had been contained. She was the vessel now, bound to carry its essence for the rest of her life. As she stumbled back to town, she realized the whispers were going in it just for her, but for the entire valley. Black Hollow was free of the entity's curse, but Evelyn had paid the price. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn left Black Hollow, unable to face the people she had saved. She moved from place to place, always staying ahead of the creeping shadows that sometimes flickered in her peripheral vision. The entity whispered to her now, its voice soft and insidious. "Set me free," it would say. "It doesn't have to end like this." But Evelyn never answered. She had made her choice, and she would bear the weight of it until her final breath. The town of Black Hollow flourished in her absence, its dark history fading into myth. But in the ruins of Ashwick Manor, the wind would sometimes carry a faint whisper, a reminder of the journalist who had given everything to silence the voices from the ashes.